What if the story of ancient Israel is not as simple as one God from the very beginning? Long before Yahweh stood alone, Israel's ancestors knew a world filled with many gods, Baal, Asherah, and others now erased from memory. These forgotten deities shaped beliefs, rituals, and even the language of the Bible itself. Their echoes remain hidden in scripture, archaeology, and myth, waiting to be rediscovered. In this video, we uncover the gods who walked beside Yahweh, the rivals and companions who shaped Israel's spiritual past, and why their memory was nearly erased from history. The Bible presents the story of Israel as one of devotion to a single God, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yet, behind the text, in archaeology, linguistics, and comparative mythology, a different picture emerges. It is a picture of a people whose earliest religious practices were not strictly monotheistic, but part of the wider Near Eastern world, a world brimming with deities, myths, and divine rivalries. These forgotten gods once stood alongside Yahweh in shrines, households, and rituals before being pushed into silence by the great monotheistic revolution. To meet these gods is not to deny Israel's faith, but to understand its roots, its struggles, and its transformation. The forgotten gods of Israel, Baal, Asherah, and others, tell a story of memory, suppression, and survival within the hidden layers of Scripture. The ancient Near Eastern context. To understand Israel's forgotten gods, we must first see the environment in which Israel emerged. The land of Canaan, where Israelite identity took shape, was not an isolated place. It was part of the larger ancient Near Eastern world, which included Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant. In this world, polytheism was the norm. Cities had patron deities, families honored household gods, and kings built temples to storm gods, fertility goddesses, and celestial beings. The Canaanites, who lived in the land before and alongside the Israelites, worshipped a pantheon led by El, the high god. Their myths, preserved in the Ugaritic texts from Ras Shamra, modern Syria, reveal a vibrant pantheon: El, the father of gods; Baal, the storm god; Asherah, the mother goddess; Anat, the warrior, and many others. When the Israelites settled in the land, they did not enter a spiritual vacuum. They inherited, borrowed, adapted, and eventually transformed these deities into their own evolving religious framework. El, the high god of the Canaanites. One of the most striking discoveries about Israel's past is the role of El, the supreme god of the Canaanite pantheon. El was called El Elyon, God Most High, and El Shaddai, God of the mountains. He was described as the father of gods and humans, enthroned at the head of the divine council. In early Israelite religion, traces of El remain. The very name Israel means he who struggles with El. The patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at various points worshipped a deity referred to as El Shaddai. In Genesis 14, Abraham encounters Melchizedek, the priest of El Elyon, suggesting that El was considered the high god of Salem, later Jerusalem. Over time, Yahweh and El seemed to merge. Yahweh, originally a distinct deity, took on the titles and functions of El. The high god of Canaan became fused with the national god of Israel, and eventually, El's identity was fully absorbed. But the traces remain in the Bible's language, reminding us of an earlier time when El stood apart. Baal, the storm god and rival of Yahweh. If El was absorbed into Yahweh, Baal became the great rival. Baal was the storm god, bringer of rain and fertility. For an agrarian society dependent on rainfall, Baal's power was undeniable. In the Ugaritic texts, Baal battles the sea god Yam and death itself, rising as the victorious provider of life. The Bible contains echoes of Baal's importance in Canaan. The Israelites repeatedly fell into Baal worship, according to the prophets. The book of Judges describes cycles of Israel turning to Baal and being punished by Yahweh. Elijah's famous confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel dramatizes this rivalry. Yahweh sends fire from heaven, proving his supremacy over the storm god. Why was Baal so dangerous? Because his cult was deeply attractive. His worship involved seasonal festivals, fertility rituals, and promises of agricultural prosperity. For Israelites living in Canaan, Baal was a god you could not easily ignore. By demonizing Baal, Israelite prophets defined Yahweh's uniqueness. But in doing so, they preserved the memory of Baal's power, ironically ensuring that we still remember him as one of Israel's forgotten gods. Asherah, the forgotten mother goddess. Perhaps the most fascinating forgotten deity is Asherah, the great mother goddess of Canaan. She was the consort of El, the nurturer of the divine council, and the fertility goddess who ensured life and abundance. In the Ugaritic texts, she is called Lady Asherah of the Sea. But did Israel once worship Asherah? Archaeology suggests yes. Inscriptions discovered at Kuntalat Adrud and Khirbet El-Kam, sites in ancient Israel, contain blessings in the name of Yahweh and his Asherah. These inscriptions strongly suggest that some Israelites believed Yahweh had a consort. Biblical texts hint at this as well. The Asherah pole, a sacred wooden object linked to goddess worship, appears repeatedly in the books of Kings and Chronicles, often destroyed by reforming kings. The fact that reformers kept needing to remove Asherah poles implies that her worship was deeply entrenched. If El was absorbed into Yahweh and Baal was demonized, Asherah was erased. The idea of Yahweh having a consort was incompatible with monotheism. Yet the archaeological evidence whispers her name, reminding us that Israel's early faith once had room for the divine feminine. The divine council, a forgotten assembly. The Bible itself preserves traces of Israel's polytheistic past in its references to the divine council. In Psalm 82, God Elohim stands in the assembly of gods and pronounces judgment. In Job, the sons of God present themselves before Yahweh. These passages suggest that early Israel imagined Yahweh not as solitary, but as presiding over a heavenly court, much like El in the Canaanite myths. Later interpretation redefined these beings as angels rather than gods, but the original context points to an older belief in a pantheon, with Yahweh as chief. The forgotten gods of Israel thus linger even in Scripture, hidden beneath layers of reinterpretation. Other forgotten figures. Beyond El, Baal, and Asherah, other divine figures once held sway in Israel's memory. Anat, a fierce warrior goddess in Canaanite mythology. She is rarely mentioned in the Bible, but may lie behind some depictions of divine warfare. Astarte Ishtar, a goddess of love and war associated with fertility rites. The Bible condemns her worship as foreign, but she was widely revered in the region. Resheph, a god of plague and war, mentioned in Ugaritic texts and hinted at in biblical poetry. Shemesh Shamash, the sun god, whose name appears in places like Beth Shemesh, house of the sun. These deities were not merely foreign imports. They were part of the cultural and religious environment of ancient Israel, influencing practices, names, and rituals. From polytheism to monotheism, the rise of Yahweh as the sole God of Israel did not happen overnight. It was a long, contested process. In the earliest stages, Yahweh may have been a regional deity associated with the southern deserts. Some scholars trace his origins to Edom or Midian. Over time, he merged with El and took on supreme authority. The prophets Elijah, Hosea, Jeremiah, Isaiah fought against Baal worship and insisted on Yahweh alone. The reforms of kings like Hezekiah and Josiah centralized worship in Jerusalem, banning local shrines and suppressing Asherah. The Babylonian exile, which shattered Israel's identity, ultimately pushed the community towards strict monotheism, a single God, universal and transcendent, unlike any other. In this transformation, the forgotten gods were either absorbed, demonized, or erased. El became Yahweh. Baal became the enemy. Asherah disappeared. Others faded into obscurity. Yet the echoes remain, scattered through scripture, inscriptions, and myth. Why were these gods forgotten? The forgetting of Israel's other gods was not accidental. It was the result of a deliberate theological project. Monotheism demanded exclusivity, and exclusivity required erasing rivals. To secure Yahweh's supremacy, prophets and reformers rewrote the story of Israel's past. But memory cannot be completely erased. The forgotten gods linger in the names of places, in the faint outlines of myths, in the condemnations that betray their former popularity, and in the archaeological remains that defy silence. Their erasure tells us as much about the power of ideology as their memory does about ancient faith. To forget is itself a form of remembering. By erasing, the monotheistic tradition acknowledged that these gods once mattered. Why this matters today. Meeting the forgotten gods of Israel is not about undermining faith. It is about understanding history. It shows us that religion is not static, but dynamic, shaped by culture, conflict, and transformation. For believers, it may deepen appreciation of the uniqueness of monotheism, born out of struggle with powerful rivals. For historians, it illuminates the interconnectedness of the ancient Near East. For seekers, it reveals the richness of humanity's spiritual imagination, in which gods rise, fall, and sometimes return in new forms. These forgotten gods also challenge us to consider how memory and power interact. Which stories are preserved? Which are erased? Which truths survive? And which are silenced? By uncovering Israel's forgotten gods, we gain a fuller, richer, and more honest picture of the past, a past that shaped the world's great monotheistic traditions. The echoes of forgotten gods. The history of ancient Israel is often told as the triumph of monotheism, the rise of Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who demanded exclusive devotion and shaped the foundation of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Yet beneath this familiar story lies another, quieter narrative, a story of gods who once stood alongside Yahweh, contended with him, or were absorbed into his being. These deities, El, Baal, Asherah, Anat, Astarte, Resheph, and others, echo through scripture, archaeology, and myth. Though silenced by reformers and prophets, their presence lingers, haunting the biblical text and challenging us to remember that Israel's journey to monotheism was neither simple nor sudden. To hear these echoes is to step into the contested world of ancient belief, where gods rose and fell, merged and transformed, and where the lines between worship and heresy were constantly redrawn. El, the high God who became Yahweh. In the pantheon of Canaan, El was supreme, called El Elyon, God Most High, and El Shaddai, God of the mountain. He presided over the divine council as the father of gods and humans. He was a figure of wisdom and stability, enthroned and eternal. The echoes of El resound in Israel's earliest traditions. The very name Israel, he who struggles with El, testifies to El's prominence. In Genesis, the patriarchs encounter El in various forms. Abraham worships El Elyon in Salem. Jacob raises an altar to El Bethel. Isaac invokes El Shaddai. These are not yet references to Yahweh, but to a God whose authority was already ancient in the land. Over time, however, Yahweh took on El's identity. Yahweh, originally associated with the deserts of the south, absorbed El's titles and functions. By the period of the monarchy, Yahweh was no longer one God among many, but the Most High himself. The distinction faded, but the memory of El survives in language and fragments of tradition. Thus, El did not vanish. He became Yahweh, his identity subsumed and preserved. His echo is strongest not in opposition, but in transformation. The forgotten God who lives on through merger. Baal, the rival who would not disappear. If El was absorbed, Baal was demonized. Known as the storm god, Baal was the bringer of rain, fertility, and life. His mythology, preserved in the Ugaritic texts, describes his battles against Yam, the sea, and Mot death, casting him as the victorious guarantor of fertility. For an agrarian society like Israel, dependent on rain for survival, Baal was a compelling god. His worship involved seasonal rituals, processions, and ecstatic practices designed to secure the blessing of the skies. The Bible preserves this rivalry in vivid detail. The book of Judges repeatedly condemns Israel for whoring after the Baals. Elijah's dramatic contest with Baal's prophets on Mount Carmel stages Yahweh and Baal as opposing forces, with fire from heaven proving Yahweh's supremacy. Hosea equates Baal worship with adultery, casting Israel as an unfaithful spouse. Yet these denunciations betray Baal's popularity. A rival forgotten by history leaves no trace, but Baal is remembered precisely because he was so deeply entrenched. He haunted Israel's imagination as the God who would not disappear, forcing prophets to sharpen their vision of Yahweh by defining him against the stormbringer. The echo of Baal is one of confrontation. He was cast as false, but in being resisted so fiercely, he remains vividly present in the memory of Israel's faith. Asherah, the silence consort. Among the most intriguing echoes is Asherah, the mother goddess. In Canaanite religion, she was the consort of El, the nurturer of the divine family, associated with fertility and abundance. She was often represented by wooden poles or sacred trees planted beside shrines. Archaeological discoveries at Kuntalat Edrud and Khirbet el-Kham reveal inscriptions invoking blessings by Yahweh and his Asherah. These inscriptions suggest that some Israelites believed Yahweh had a divine consort, merging Asherah into his cult. The biblical record supports this. Asherah poles appear frequently in the books of Kings and Chronicles, destroyed repeatedly by reforming monarchs, but evidently restored by their successors. Yet in the long march toward monotheism, Asherah became intolerable. To admit Yahweh had a consort undermined the exclusivity of his worship. Thus she was erased, her image smashed, her cult denounced. But her echo lingers. It whispers in the archaeological record, in the persistence of her name, and in the absence left behind by her suppression. Her silence speaks volumes. Israel's faith once had room for the divine feminine, a space later closed off. The divine council, gods reduced to servants. The Bible itself preserves remnants of a polytheistic worldview in its references to the divine council. Psalm 82 describes God standing in the assembly of the gods, judging them. Job 1 depicts the sons of God, presenting themselves before Yahweh. These images echo the Canaanite model of El presiding over a court of deities. Later interpretation softened these portrayals, recasting the sons of God as angels. But the original imagery suggests that Yahweh was once understood as presiding over a council of divine beings, not alone in the heavens, but first among peers. The echo here is structural, a memory of a pantheon reinterpreted into monotheism. The gods became angels, their divinity diminished, but not erased. Anat, the warrior forgotten. In the myths of Ugarit, Anat was a fierce warrior goddess, sister, and sometimes consort of Baal. She slaughtered enemies, scattered armies, and reveled in blood. She was terrifying, yet protective, a defender of her brother and his kingdom. While the Bible does not name her directly, some scholars detect echoes of Anat in biblical traditions of divine warfare. Yahweh himself is sometimes portrayed in strikingly violent, almost mythic terms, marching from the south, shaking the mountains, splitting the seas. These motifs may have once belonged to Anat or been shared with her. Anat's echo is faint, barely audible, but perhaps it remains in the martial imagery of Israel's warrior god. Astarte, Ishtar, the star of desire. Astarte, often equated with Mesopotamia's Ishtar, was a goddess of love, war, and fertility. Associated with the morning star Venus, she embodied both beauty and ferocity. Her cult spread widely across the Near East, reaching into Canaan and influencing Israelite religion. The Bible condemns her explicitly, grouping her with foreign gods to be shunned. Yet the need to condemn indicates her presence. Rituals dedicated to Astarte may have blended with those of Asherah, and her imagery likely influenced biblical critiques of idolatry linked to sexuality and fertility. Her echo is one of allure and danger, a goddess both desired and denounced. Resheph, the god of plague and fire. Among the lesser-known figures is Resheph, a Canaanite god associated with plague, pestilence, and warfare. His name appears in Egyptian texts as a deity adopted into their pantheon, and faint traces appear in biblical poetry. Habakkuk 3 speaks of pestilence going before Yahweh and plague following at his heels, imagery that may once have evoked Resheph's presence. In Israel's tradition, Resheph's powers were absorbed into Yahweh's arsenal. Plague and pestilence became tools of Yahweh's judgment, his arrows against the nations. Resheph was forgotten, but his function survived. His echo remains in the destructive side of divine power. The process of erasure. How did these gods become forgotten? The process was gradual, driven by both political and theological forces. Centralization of worship. Kings like Hezekiah and Josiah sought to consolidate power by centralizing worship in Jerusalem, eliminating local shrines where other deities might be honored. Prophetic denunciations. Prophets condemned rival gods, labeling them false, powerless, or demonic. This rhetoric framed Yahweh as unique and supreme. Exile and crisis. The Babylonian exile forced a radical rethinking of faith. Stripped of land, temple, and monarchy, Israel clung to a God beyond borders, universal and exclusive. Redefinition of rivals. Forgotten gods were recast as angels, demons, or metaphors, their divinity erased, but their memory preserved in new forms. This process was not tidy. It left traces, contradictions, and echoes that still resonate in the text and archaeology. Why the echoes matter. Why should we care about gods Israel sought to forget? Because their echoes reveal the dynamic, contested nature of religious history. They show transformation. Monotheism did not appear in a vacuum, but grew through dialogue, rivalry, and absorption of older traditions. They recover suppressed voices. The memory of Asherah reminds us that the divine feminine once had a place in Israel's imagination. They illuminate Scripture. References to Baal, the divine council, or plague make richer sense when seen against this wider backdrop. They challenge assumptions. The story of Yahweh's rise is not a straight line, but a tangled path shaped by cultural exchange and theological struggle. The echoes of forgotten gods expand, rather than diminish, the story of Israel. The legacy of forgotten gods. Even in their erasure, these gods left legacies that shaped later faith. Yahweh's thunder echoes Baal's storms. Yahweh's titles preserve El's majesty. The absence of Asherah creates questions about gender and divinity. The divine council foreshadows later angelology. These legacies ripple outward into Christianity and Islam, which inherited Yahweh's supremacy, but also preserved fragments of older imagery: angels, demons, cosmic battles, and visions of heavenly courts. The forgotten gods of Israel may no longer be worshipped, but their fingerprints remain on the world's greatest religions. Listening to the echoes. The story of Israel is not only the rise of Yahweh, but also the silencing of others. El-absorbed Baal opposed, Asherah erased, a not forgotten, a stark condemned, Resheph diminished. They stand in the margins of the Bible, not fully gone, their echoes reverberating through the text and the stones of archaeology. To listen to these echoes is not to undermine faith, but to deepen it, to see how the God of Israel emerged from a chorus of voices and claimed a singular song. The forgotten gods remind us that the past is complex, that memory and forgetting are intertwined, and that even silence can speak. They are forgotten, yet not gone. Their echoes remain, waiting for us to hear them in the whispers of Scripture, the ruins of shrines, and the questions that linger. The forgotten gods of Israel remind us that history is never as straightforward as we're taught. Beneath the surface of the Bible lies a story of many deities, shifting beliefs, and a people searching for identity. By remembering El, Baal, Asherah, and others, we gain a richer picture of Israel's past and a deeper understanding of how faith evolves. If this journey into hidden history sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold truths. Join the conversation in the comments, and let's keep exploring the mysteries that still shape our world today.